Notre Dame, how to set up and play. The first thing you'll do is lay out the game board. You'll start by selecting a centerpiece based on the number of players. The square is used in a 2 and a 4 player game. In a 2-player game, use this side, flip it over in a 4-player game. If it was a 3-player game, we'd use the triangle, and in a 5-player game, we'd use the pentagon. Next, you'll put out a burrow for each player. You'll align the burrow to the center tile based on the icon there. So you can see in a 2 or a 4-player game, you make sure this is adjoining. If this was a 3-player game, you can see the triangle right there. And a 5-player game, you can see the symbol there. Player's burrow, you're going to put their carriage in the middle. You're going to shuffle the message tokens and randomly put them face up in the market spots. And then you'll put a black cube, this is their rat track, and you'll start it on 0. As part of a special setup for a 2-player game, which I'm setting this up for, you actually put out 2 other player boards as if it was a 4-player game. You'll put out their message tokens in their color on each of the boards, and these will be available to both of the 2 players to get with their carriage. Each player will get 4 of their influence cubes. They'll get 1 trusted friend token. They'll start with 3 gold, and they'll get their specific hand of 9 action cards. The remaining cubes for each player just go into the general supply here. Next, you'll set up the person cards throughout the game. These are the brown person cards. There's 6 of them. They're unmarked, so you'll just shuffle these. These will get used throughout the game and reused a couple times. And then you set up the special gray person cards. I'm playing with the expansion. So in addition to the ones that came in the base game, there are additional A, B, and C cards. If you're playing with all the expansion cards, take all the A cards, shuffle them together, and deal 3. Do the same with the B cards and the same with the C cards. So you're going to stack these up, B's on top of C's, with 3 A cards on top of those. Before you actually do the shuffling, the ones you select, it's important to show those to all the players so they can see the different types of persons that will come out throughout the duration of the game. And then shuffle the A stack, B stack, C stack, and stack them as shown. The unused special gray person cards can get returned to the game box. The game is going to last a total of 9 rounds. Each round has 5 phases. The first phase of every round is we're going to reveal the new person cards. You always take 1 of the gray and then 2 of the brown. So 3 person cards will get revealed at the start of every round. Each player is going to shuffle first and then draw their top 3 action cards. And then we'll do a drafting sequence around the table. The third phase, every player, one at a time, will get to play 1 of their action cards. We'll do that twice, so in each round, players will play 2 of their 3 action cards available to them. Then there's a chance to hire one of the shown persons, and then we go through the plague phase. So let's discuss each one. So at the start of each of the 9 rounds, the first thing we do is reveal the new persons. We take 1 of the grays, and we take 2 of the brown people. These will be persons available to hire at the end of the round, but we also notice the rat icon on each of the cards, so we know that the plague is going to be 2 strong or 2 rats strong at the end of the round, so make note of that. After the persons are revealed, each player has their shuffled deck, and they're going to reveal the top 3 cards. And they're actually only revealed to themselves. They keep these hidden from the other players, but they're going to decide of these 3 cards which one they definitely want to keep, and then which 2 they're willing to pass to other players. All players will pass the 2 they do not select to the player to their left. Each player will now take the 2 cards that they were passed, look at these, and then make a decision of just these 2 cards, not the one they originally kept, which one they would like to keep out of these 2. They'll make that decision, and then they'll pass the card they didn't select again to their left. Third card that they receive, they're just obligated to keep. Since this is a 2-player game, the passing results in a player getting two of their own color, potentially, and one of the other player's colors. Once all players have their 3 cards, you're ready to start the action phase. Phase is going to start with the current start player. To start the game, that was just randomly determined. The start player will be given the Hunchback token, and the start player will now make a decision of playing one of their 3 available cards. The card will get played face up. The player will execute the action on one card, and then play will rotate clockwise, and then the next player would play one card face up and take the action. It would come back around, and then the player would play their second card. They only get to play 2 cards per round, so one of their 3 cards is going to remain unplayed. It can stay hidden which one they decide not to choose. So if they decide to play this card as their second card, they can tuck the unplayed one underneath it so it's not shown, and just put that to the face-up play pile. And then execute this action. Again, move around the table until all players have played their second action card. 1 point, it isn't required that you have to execute the action on the card. If you're not able to or unwilling to execute the action, you can simply play the card and decline to take the action. Before we actually move on to the person's phase, let's actually see what all the different actions do. First action is the Cloister School. It allows you to put a cube here on your player board and then take 1 cube from the supply to your own personal stock for each cube currently in this spot. So to play the Cloister, you would take 1 from your personal supply, place it on the Cloister, on the game board, and then based on the number of cubes that were here, including the one you just placed, you would get that many cubes from the supply. So since this is the first one I placed, I'm only able to take 1 from the supply and add it to my personal supply. If there were multiple here, if I was adding this and there were already 3 here for a total of 4, then I could grab 4 cubes from the general supply and add them to my personal supply. The next action is the bank. It works much the same way. You put a cube here on the bank, and then you can take 1 coin for each cube here. So again, from your supply, out onto your board, and then based on the number of cubes here, you would get those number of gold coins to your personal supply. Next is the residence. You put a cube here on the residence, and then you earn 1 prestige or victory point for each cube here. So again, 1 cube from your personal supply onto the residence, and then based on the number of influence markers here, you would take victory points from the supply. Victory points are kept hidden throughout the game. Everything else in terms of gold and influence cubes are public to players. The prestige or victory points come in denominations of 1, 3, 5, and 10. Next action is the carriage house. You put a cube here in the carriage house, and you can move your coach up to 1 market for each cube already there. And then you can take the message token wherever you end your movement. So if I was adding 1 cube, and let's say I already had 1 in the carriage house, by adding this one, now I can move my carriage up to 2 spaces. They travel along these routes. Each space, these market spots, count as spaces, whether they're empty or occupied. So since I can move 2, I could go 1, I could stop my movement there, I can go up to 2 since I had 2 cubes there, and then maybe I go 2. Wherever I end my movement, I can collect that message. Whenever you collect the message, you immediately score it. So in this example, it would give me 4 prestige or 4 victory point tokens. An important rule about the messages, you have to collect them in complete sets before you can get a duplicate of any one color. So before I could get another green, I would have to get a purple and a blue, and before I could get another one of these, I would have to complete the set. In this game, it's set up with 4 different color sets, so I would have had to collected a carriage token of yellow. At this point, I can start getting a duplicate in any of the colors. And it keeps working in the same way. So if I collected that one, obviously I couldn't get another green until I completed another whole set. And it's not sets based on the type, it's just sets based on the color. So you can have duplicates of the same type It's just you've got to get a complete color set before you can get a duplicate color. Here are the 4 different types of message tokens. This one you immediately get 1 victory point and a gold coin, 2 victory points and a cube from the general supply, 3 victory points and you can move your rat track back 1 space. If it's already on 0, you can't go below that. And this one is just 4 victory points. One other point about carriage movement, you're only ever obligated to stop on these market spots, so you can always move to the center as one of your movements. If you're moving along this outside, you can see this isn't a stopping point. So for one movement, you could go all the way around the perimeter, and that would be your second one. You're only ever obligated to stop at these intersections where there's a market spot. And again, it's whether they're complete or empty that counts as a movement stop. The next action is the hotel. When you place a cube on the hotel, you get the option of taking a cube from the general supply, a gold, or you can move back 1 on the rat track. You only get to select one of those. If it's your 3rd cube or more in the hotel, you can actually take 2 of these 3 actions. So you could choose 2 different, or you could choose the same one twice. So to execute this, I would take a cube from my personal supply. I only have 2 there. I don't have the 3 required to get me 2 of the actions, and then I get my choice. Cube, gold, or move back 1 on my rat track. Next action is the hospital. You put a cube here, and then you can move back 1 on the rat track. It doesn't matter how many cubes you have there. You always only move back 1 on your rat track immediately. But then during the plague phase, when these rats get advanced on your rat track, it's that total minus the number of cubes you currently have on the hospital. So right now it's only 1, so during plague phase it would be 2 less 1. I would only have to advance up 1 on the rat track when we get to the plague phase. The next action is the park. You put a cube here. Again, you immediately move back 1 space on the rat track. It doesn't matter how many cubes you have in the park. You only move back 1 immediately. But then, for every pair of cubes you have in the park, whenever you take an action that results in prestige or victory points, you get to collect 1 additional victory point per pair of cubes. So if you had 4 cubes in the park, any action that you took to get victory points, let's say it was an action of cashing in 1 of these to get 2 victory points, and if you had 2 pairs, that would be 2 additional victory points. One thing I haven't mentioned yet about placing cubes, if you ever run out of cubes in your personal supply, it doesn't necessarily prevent you from taking the action. You could still play the action card, you would just have to take a cube from a different sector in your burrow and move it to where you're taking the action based on the card. You could even take that cube out of Notre Dame if you had cubes there, which is the action we'll talk about next. The only restriction is you couldn't move your trusted friend as if you were pulling a cube. That's a different action. The next action is Notre Dame, where you place a cube in Notre Dame, which gives you the ability to make a donation. You can donate 1, 2, or 3 gold to get 1, 3, or 6 victory points. So again, if I had no cubes in my supply, I could pull 1 from somewhere on my board, place it there because I'd like to make a donation, and I will donate 1 gold, which immediately goes to the general supply, and then in that example, I get 1 victory point. The benefit of having cubes in Notre Dame is at the end of the 3rd, 6th, and 9th rounds, Notre Dame will get scored. So a total of 6 victory points will be distributed between each of the cubes in Notre Dame. So if there's only 1 cube in here, that would be worth all 6 victory points. If there were 2 cubes, whether they're the same color or different colors, those would get split. So they would each be worth 3 victory points. The final action is the trusted friend. You get to move your trusted friend pawn to one of the buildings and carry out the action there. So at the start of the game, he starts outside of your burrow, so you can move him to any of the sectors in your burrow only and immediately carry out the action. Again, placing him, he always counts as a cube, So placing him here would give you a strength of 2 for this action, so you would collect 2 victory points. If we were playing the trusted friend on a subsequent turn, the pawn always has to move. You couldn't replay the same area. He has to move to a different sector in your burrow and carry out the action. Also, if you were taking a different action and you were placing a cube right there, he always counts as a cube. So that would give you a strength of 3 when taking that action. So once all players have played their 2 cards and have discarded their third one, starting in turn order, they can hire one of the persons. It always costs 1 gold to hire the person regardless of which one they pick, and then they carry out the action. Then we go clockwise, and the next player has the option to hire one of these. They can hire the same worker or the same person, or they can hire a different one. If a player got to this phase with no gold, then they miss out. They don't have the ability to hire one of the 3 persons. Once all players have had the chance to hire a person, we do the plague. You count the number of rats at the bottom of all of the 3 shown cards, and all players will advance their rat track based on that number, less any cubes they have in the hospital. So in this example, the yellow player has 3 cubes and their trusted friend, which always counts as a cube, so they have 4. So 2 less 4, they actually get to move their track backwards. So you can actually move backwards if your hospital value exceeds the number of rats in the plague. It's okay for your rat track to get all the way up to 9 as long as it doesn't exceed it. If and when it ever exceeds it, the marker would just stay on 9. So whether you exceeded it by 1 or by 5, it would stay on 9, but then the player would suffer a penalty. They immediately lose 2 prestige, so they've got to return 2 of their victory points back to the supply, and then they look at their burrow, and whatever is the most populated burrow or populated sector in their burrow, they've got to lose a cube from that area. And remember to always count the trusted friend when considering the most populated sector. So here we can see it was their hospital where they have a total value of 4, so they'd have to take one of these cubes and return it to the general supply if they exceeded 9. 2 other points: if 2 sectors were tied, the player can decide which cube to return, and it has to be a cube that's returned. It can never be the trusted friend. It also has to be a cube from your burrow board. It couldn't be a cube that you had in Notre Dame. You look at your most populated sector in your burrow. At the end of the round, you're going to discard the A card and the 2 brown cards. Deal 1 off the top of the special gray cards, and you deal the next 2 of the brown ones, and these are the persons for the next round. You're also going to take the 2 cards that each player played that round along with the one they didn't play, and they're all going to go into a combined discard pile, and the last thing you'll do at the end of the round is pass the first player marker clockwise. At the ends of the 3rd, 6th, and 9th rounds, you're also going to score Notre Dame, as we talked about. The total victory points available, based on the player count tile, are equally divided by the cubes in Notre Dame. So in this example, each of these cubes would be worth 2 points, so the purple player would get 4 points, and the yellow player would get 2. Always round down any differences. Once Notre Dame is scored, the cubes get removed and returned to the general supply. They will not stay there. Also, at the end of the 3rd and 6th rounds, all players would have discarded all 9 of their action cards. So simply just sort these out and return their colors to each of the players. At that point, they would get reshuffled, and the top 3 would get drawn to restart the process. Also, at the end of the 3rd and 6th rounds, you would have gone through all 6 of the brown person cards. So those 2 would get discarded. You're going to reshuffle these and then lay out 2 for the next round. The gray cards just simply progress, the 3 A's moving to now the 3 B's and eventually the 3 C's. At the end of the 9th round, the player with the most prestige or victory points wins the game. If there's a tie, tied players with the most coins plus cubes in their personal stock would break the tie. Next, let's go over all the different types of persons cards you're going to see in the game. Here are the 6 brown person cards. They're going to get reused throughout the game. When she is hired, the player gets 3 victory points and then their choice of either a gold, a cube, or moving down 1 on their rat track. The moneylender provides 2 gold coins and 1 victory point. The monk provides 2 cubes from the general supply and 1 victory point. With the minstrel, the player can move 1 to 3 influence markers. This includes their trusted friend from any one sector to any other sector in their borough, not Notre Dame, but players do not execute the action. They can simply move up to 3 to another sector. The fool lets the player move 1 influence marker or their trusted friend to any other sector in their borough, but here they actually get to execute the action immediately. When you hire the doctor, the plague value for that player and that player only is 0. Now again, if multiple players hire the doctor, then their plague value is 0. And also keep in mind, if you have cubes in the hospital and the plague value is 0, then you can move backwards on your rat track. Here are the different types of persons you would see in the A stack. The first one is the city guard. Players can take 1 victory point for each influence marker. This includes their trusted friend in each of their 7 sectors and in Notre Dame. With the night watchman, the player can take 1 victory point for each empty sector in their borough. So to be empty, a sector can't have any influence markers nor the trusted friend, and you don't include Notre Dame for this. The bishop lets the player take 1 influence marker from the general supply and place it in any empty sector in their borough, and then they can execute the corresponding action. The manager lets players double their prestige points, so the player immediately takes the number of victory points from the supply to match what they currently have, thereby doubling their total. The nurse lets players take 1 influence marker from the general supply, place it in their hospital, and move their rat marker back 1 space. The scholar lets the player immediately execute the action of their 3rd card, the one that they normally discard. When hiring the priest, the player can take 1 influence marker from the general supply and place it onto the center Notre Dame sector, but nothing else happens. The procurator allows the player to execute the action of any one of their 7 sectors, according to the influence markers in the sector. This includes their trusted friend. The bell ringer lets the player take victory points for each influence marker of their color in Notre Dame. Here are the different types of B person cards you're going to see. The guild master, the player would take 2 victory points for each of their 7 sectors where they have at least 2 influence markers. You get to count the trusted friend, but you don't look at Notre Dame. With the beggar king, players will take 1 victory point for each space beyond their rat marker. So in this example, there's 2 spaces beyond my current rat marker, so I would get 2 victory points if I hired the beggar king. With the advocate, the player will get 3 victory points for each 2 messages that they have collected so far. With the spy, the player may look at all remaining gray person cards in the stack. They can't change their order, and they also get 2 victory points. The gypsies, the player may return any number of influence markers, not the trusted friend, but any number of influence markers from the board back to the general supply, and then for each return marker, the player takes 2 victory points. With the coachman, the player may use all messages that they have collected of any one type. They could reactivate all of one type. With the trader, the player gets 1 gold coin for each of their marketplaces that don't have a message token on it anymore. So you'd be counting these empty spots where messages have already been claimed. With the benefactor, players may return any number of victory points to the supply, and then for each return victory point, they can move their rat marker back 1 place, but never below 0. And then with the butcher, the player may place 1 influence marker from the general supply into each empty sector in their borough, but the actions are not executed. Here are the C person cards. The first one is the Lady of the Court. The player can take 1 victory point for each influence marker in the sector in their borough that has the most influence markers, and this includes the Trusted Friend. With the Mayor, the player would get 3 victory points for each of their 7 sectors in which they have at least 3 influence markers, and as always, include your Trusted Friend. With the Carpenter, the player would take 1 victory point for each of their 7 sectors in which they have at least 1 influence marker, and you get to count your Trusted Friend. With the Advisor, the player may hire 2 additional persons. Each one costs 1 coin. So the player can either hire one other person twice or both of the other persons once. With the Guard, the player gets 3 victory points for every 2 of their influence markers left in their general supply. With the Host, the player would get 2 victory points for each influence marker in their hotel. When hiring the Gravedigger, players would get victory points equal to the current plague value that round. With the Actress, the player can move all influence markers, including their Trusted Friend, from one sector to any other sector in their borough and execute the corresponding action. And finally, with the Mistress, the player can take 1 influence marker from the general supply and place it in the sector where their Trusted Friend is and execute the corresponding action. And that should be everything you need to set up and play Notre Dame.